They say a single act of kindness can change the course of destiny. Picture a lone ranch on the edge of the Arizona desert, with dust swirling across endless plains. A widower named Thomas Caldwell stands at the threshold of a new day, grieving husband, struggling cattleman, and unwitting hero. When he braves a deadly river current to save a young Apache girl, he unknowingly ignites a chain of events that will challenge the boundaries of respect, loyalty, and bravery. But in the Wild West, nothing is ever straightforward. From hidden grudges to the threat of ruthless outlaws, the next few days will decide the fate of more than just one life. Thomas Caldwell often rose before dawn. On the mornings he managed any sleep at all. He'd roll out of his creaking bed, pull on his worn leather boots, and step onto the ranch porch. In these still early hours, the land stretched endlessly beneath a sky caught between dawn and night. His ranch, dubbed Caldwell's Crest, lay tucked in the high desert region near the Salt River, a flowing lifeline in Arizona territory. With each sunrise, Thomas continued a ritual he had once shared with his wife Eleanor, who'd passed away 2 years prior from complications of a persistent lung ailment. Every morning, he would stand where they used to stand together, inhaling crisp desert air, and promise to keep her dream alive. Eleanor Caldwell's dream had been a sustainable ranch that coexisted peacefully with the native tribes, forging cooperation rather than conflict. She believed that bridging cultures would make the harsh land more manageable for everyone. Her death had tested Thomas's resolve to maintain that dream. With finances stretched thin, livestock lost to predators and disease, and the looming threat of drought, the ranch wavered on the brink of failure. Yet each day, Thomas soldiered on, clinging to the hope that his work might honor her memory. On this particular morning, shadows from the rising sun caught Thomas's eye. He noticed the silhouette of a horse and rider approaching the ranch gates. It was his closest neighbor, Matthew Harris, a fellow rancher from a spread 10 miles to the east. Tall, wiry, and weather-beaten Matthew had known Thomas since both were starry-eyed newlyweds looking to carve out a life in the desert. Now they shared the common bond of losing their spouses. Matthew's wife had succumbed to influenza just a year before. Thomas offered Matthew a curt nod as the man dismounted. "Got word from town." "Tom," Matthew said, pulling out a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "Sheriff Mulligan says a group of outlaws was spotted near the Gila Pass. We'd best be watchful." Thomas had little patience for troublemakers. His ranch might have been on the edge of nowhere, but it was all he had left of Eleanor. He wouldn't let lawless men threaten his place of solace. "We'll keep an eye out," he said, scanning the horizon. After exchanging news, Matthew took his leave. Thomas turned and walked across the dusty yard, giving a quick glance at the horse corral. His best stallion, a chestnut named Sullivan, was pacing the fence line. Something in the air had Sullivan skittish an omen, maybe that a bigger storm was brewing. Thomas thought back to the last time a band of rustlers or outlaws rode through these parts. The conflict had ended in gunfire, and the local undertaker, Miss Bertha Clark, had been busy for weeks. Thomas exhaled slowly and steeled himself. The morning sun now spilled across every inch of Caldwell's Crest, illuminating the ranch in a fleeting moment of peace. It was a fragile peace Thomas knew perched on the rim of a volatile land. Soon enough, trouble would come riding up. He only hoped he'd be strong enough to face whatever tests lay ahead, just as Eleanor would have wanted him to. As he settled into the day's chores, Thomas found it impossible to banish memories of Eleanor. Every corner of the ranch reminded him of her, the lines of whitewashed fencing they'd erected side by side, the sturdy barn they'd built from reclaimed timber, even the battered rocking chair on the porch. Once Eleanor's laughter could be heard, echoing through these dusty fields. Now only silence remained. Work helped push back the loneliness. Thomas spent the next hour hauling feed to the paddocks, occasionally pausing to check fences for loose boards. The ephemeral glow of dawn gave way to the full intensity of the Arizona sun. He was mending a gate hinge near the creek that threaded along the outskirts of his property when he felt a tremor in the ground. A vague rumble grew louder with each second. Hoofbeats. He stood and peered eastward, heart pounding. He thought of outlaws had Matthew's warning come to fruition so quickly. He dashed behind a stand of mesquite trees, pressing his back against a trunk. Then he saw the newcomers, not bandits, but a small group of Apache riders, perhaps 5 or 6, moving in cautious formation. They guided their horses toward the water's edge, stopping to let the animals drink. Though he was tempted to announce his presence, Thomas stayed silent, carefully watching the scene. For years, tensions between local ranchers and Apache groups had ebbed and flowed. Eleanor had always insisted on peace treaties, but prejudice and suspicion ran deep on both sides. In turn, some Apaches mistrusted the growing presence of white settlers and the forts that dotted the territory. One of the riders dismounted. A tall man with braided hair, he wore a leather vest and moccasins embroidered with intricate patterns. He carried a hunting rifle slung across his shoulder, but appeared more thirsty than threatening. Thomas decided to take a step forward, wanting to show he was unarmed, only for a distant rifle shot to crack through the air. Instantly, the Apaches swung back onto their horses. The tall man locked eyes with Thomas for the briefest moment, neither threatened nor friendly, just resigned. Then, with a flurry of hooves, the group disappeared. Thomas's heart thudded in his chest. The shot had sounded far off, but he was certain the Apaches had assumed danger was close. He scanned the horizon but saw no one. Perhaps a careless hunter or a ranch hand firing at coyotes. Regardless, the moment had passed, and Thomas was alone by the creek once more. He wondered if that fleeting encounter would lead to future trouble. He shook his head, remembering how passionately Eleanor had believed in forging alliances. She would have walked right out and offered a handshake. Eleanor Thomas murmured, leaning against the mesquite bark, "Am I doing the right thing?" Without an answer, he returned to mending the gate. Yet apprehension stuck with him like a burr. Their presence near his ranch meant the lines between homestead and tribal land were shifting. Whether for better or worse, the Apaches would remain on his mind for the rest of the day, and soon enough they would take center stage in a drama that no one could have foreseen. 2 days later, a rare bout of fierce rain pummeled the region. Gray clouds barreled across the sky, and the Salt River swelled with runoff from the distant mountains. It was unusual this early in the season for such a storm to unleash enough fury to turn the river into a raging torrent. But by late afternoon, the usually tranquil banks were unrecognizable. Thomas, out repairing wind-damaged fence posts, noticed the muddy water swirling higher than he'd ever seen. Chunks of uprooted debris, tree branches, brush, even battered fence segments hurtled downstream. He weighed heading back to the ranch before the worst of it hit. But then something in the current caught his eye, a single dark figure thrashing in the water. At first he thought it was an animal, maybe a calf swept away. But as he sprinted closer, sliding on the wet banks, Thomas realized with horror that it was a young Apache girl, no older than 13. She was tangled in what looked like a rotted tree limb, fighting to keep her head above the water. Thomas didn't hesitate. He dropped his tool belt on the bank and dived into the raging current, arms slicing through water thick with silt. The pull of the river nearly dragged him under, but adrenaline surged as he caught up to the girl. Her eyes were wide with panic. She gasped for air between waves, too frightened even to struggle. "Hold on!" Thomas shouted, gripping her arm. The force of the water tugged them both downstream. He fought to keep them afloat, every muscle burning with exertion. At last he managed to free her from the snaring branch, but the current pushed them into a swirling eddy, buffeting them against the rocky bottom. Thomas clung to the girl with one arm, desperately paddling with the other. For an instant he thought all hope was lost. His lungs felt like they might burst. Then in a final surge the river spat them out onto a narrower bank. He coughed violently, pulling the girl onto the muddy shore. She was pale and shaking, but breathing. Her eyes flickered open, registering his presence. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She responded in Apache words he didn't understand, but recognized as gratitude. He nodded. Exhaustion weighing on him like a lead blanket. Adrenaline rain and cold soaked his bones. Carefully he helped the girl stand. She could barely hold her footing on the slippery mud. Thomas took off his drenched jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. While the rain pounded relentlessly, they made their way to higher ground. A short way from the river, Thomas found partial shelter under a rocky ledge. There he gathered branches and managed to start a small fire with matches he'd kept in a waterproof case, an old habit from years of frontier living. As the flames danced, the girl blinked uncertainly at Thomas. Her lips quivered. He realized she was beyond shocked, terrified to be alone with a stranger, and in pain. He set a comforting hand on her shoulder, murmuring nonsensical words of reassurance. In that moment, it didn't matter that they came from different worlds. All that mattered was survival. In the swirling backdrop of rain and thunder, an act of mercy forged a bond that would soon reverberate across the desert. Once the worst of the storm passed, Thomas hoisted the girl onto Sullivan, the one horse brave enough to approach the raging river. With the darkness of night pressing in, he took her back to Caldwell's Crest. Upon arriving, he guided her carefully into the ranch's modest living quarters, ignoring the mud that soaked into every corner. Inside, a warm lantern glow revealed the girl's injuries. More clearly, scrapes along her arms and legs, bruises forming on her side. She trembled either from cold or shock, or both. Moving with gentle efficiency, Thomas prepared a basin of warm water. He cleaned her cuts and offered a spare blanket to wrap around her small frame. When he tried to ask her name, she clutched the blanket tighter, uncertain. Then through chattering teeth, she spoke softly. "Naha." Thomas nodded. At least he had something to call her now. He made a silent vow to get her the help she needed, even if it meant traveling across the territory to find her family. But first, her wounds needed tending. She was fragile as a newborn foal, and he feared infection might set in if not addressed quickly. The following day, the rain had subsided, leaving behind a damp hush. Naha slept fitfully on a makeshift bed near the fireplace. From time to time, she muttered in her own language, often jolting awake as if from nightmares. Thomas suspected she was replaying the terror of the river. He wished he could speak her tongue to assure her she was safe. In the meantime, he did what he could. Offered warm broth, changed her bandages, and tried a few words of broken Spanish, hoping she might understand. She nodded politely, but said little. By mid-afternoon, he decided to ride into the nearby town of Stonewell to seek medical supplies. The storm had left the roads in poor condition, slick with mud, pocked by deep ruts. But he urged Sullivan forward. After an hour of careful travel, the horse's hooves finally clopped onto Stonewell's main street. There, a scattering of wooden buildings housed everything from a small mercantile to a blacksmith's shop. The saloon, aptly named the Dusty Rose, offered a respite for travelers and local ranchers alike. Thomas headed straight for Wilcox's general store, owned by the industrious Helen Wilcox, who also served as the town's unofficial nurse. She looked up from behind a stack of flour sacks. "Lord above Tom, you look half drowned," she said, eyeing his still sodden boots. "What can I do for you?" he explained in cautious tones that he'd rescued an Apache girl. To his relief, Helen didn't bat an eyelash. She simply bustled around, collecting herbs, bandages, and ointments into a neat pile on the counter. "Here," she said briskly, "give her plenty of rest. If the bruises are deep, you might want to consider the army doctor at Fort Bowie, but that's a ride from here." Fort Bowie was half a day's journey away, and Thomas wasn't certain if exposing Naha to the presence of soldiers, some of whom had clashed violently with Apaches, was wise. For now, he'd follow Helen's advice and keep Naha at the ranch until she was stronger. He thanked Helen, paid for the supplies, and rode back to Caldwell's Crest. That evening, he found Naha awake and peering at her surroundings. She still trembled slightly, but managed a faint smile when he handed her some herbal tea. In her eyes, he caught a fleeting sense of relief, maybe even trust. Though language was a barrier, kindness needed no translation. And in that quiet moment, as the sun dipped over the desert horizon, Thomas couldn't help but sense that his life had turned a new page, one that connected him to the memory of Eleanor's dreams more than ever before. Word travels fast in small frontier towns, and by the following morning, rumors of Thomas's rescue had spread through every saloon and trading post in the region. Some folks viewed it as a remarkable act of courage, reminiscent of how the West ought to be a place of hard work and neighborly values. But others, especially a handful of ranchers who had experienced raids in the past, muttered disapproval. They believed the Apaches were not to be trusted and saw Thomas's actions as naive. Among them was John Holcomb, a man with a deep scar across his cheek who ran one of the largest cattle operations in the valley. Rumor said that years ago, Apaches had stolen several of his prized horses, leaving him a bitter man. He was overheard telling the local blacksmith that Caldwell thinks he's doing a good deed. He'll be sorry when they come for him. Meanwhile, Thomas was unaware of the swirling gossip. He spent the morning at Naha's bedside, ensuring she had something to eat and that her bandages remained clean. She had improved slightly overnight, though her breathing was still labored. Occasionally she would speak in quiet, halting Spanish, explaining that she'd been out gathering medicinal plants near the riverbank when the sudden storm and rising waters swept her away. She also mentioned something about her father, Thomas, caught the word ata, which in some Apache dialects means father. She made gestures indicating that her father was likely worried about her. Thomas nodded in understanding and assured her in his broken Spanish that he intended to find him. In that moment, a knock sounded at the door. Thomas rose carefully. Opening it, he found Sheriff James Mulligan, a tall man with a neatly trimmed mustache, standing on the porch. "Morning, Caldwell," said the sheriff, glancing around the ranch interior. "Heard about your rescue. Word in town says you've got a young Apache under your roof." Thomas stepped aside, letting Mulligan enter. He respected the sheriff. Mulligan had helped put away more than one group of rustlers, but he also knew the man answered to public pressure. Mulligan removed his wide-brimmed hat, scanning the meager furnishings, before catching sight of Naha under the blanket. "We've had some tension with local tribes," Mulligan said gently. "You sure you know what you're doing, keeping her here?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "She's hurt, Sheriff. Can't just toss her out." Mulligan rubbed his chin. "Look, Tom, I'm not saying you should. I just want you to be aware there might be consequences." Her people might not like that she's here. Some ranchers won't like it either. Thomas exhaled, shoulders stiffening. He recalled how passionately Eleanor had worked to build bridges. I'm taking care of her, that's all. The sheriff nodded, eyes flickering with concern. I know you mean well. Just be careful. If you need help or if anything goes south, let me know. With that, he tipped his hat and departed, leaving Thomas to wonder if Mulligan had just offered official support or a gentle warning. From across the room, Naha watched with solemn eyes, sensing the gravity of the conversation. The hush that followed was deafening. Even as her injuries began to heal, the world outside, this ranch was growing uneasy. Acts of compassion could be misconstrued. Fears and whispers thrived in the harshness of the frontier. But Thomas had made his choice. He would protect the girl until she was well. He only hoped he wouldn't pay too high a price for doing the right thing. Over the next few days, Naha's condition steadily improved. Her bruises began to fade, and the color returned to her cheeks. Each morning, Thomas would check her bandages, offering a respectful nod and a shy smile. She responded in kind, grateful for his patience. Tentative conversations arose, aided by gestures and the occasional Spanish phrase. Thomas learned that Naha belonged to a small band of Apache who ranged the region near the White Mountains, to the north following seasonal hunting patterns. Her father Chato was a skilled hunter and a respected voice in their group. She had traveled down toward the river alone to harvest a particular herb used for fevers, never expecting the storm that nearly claimed her life. As her strength returned, Naha expressed a strong desire to reunite with her family. This worried Thomas. The accidental crossing of paths might have inflamed tensions, and he had no clue how her people would react to a white rancher housing one of their own. Still, he believed the only honorable course was to help her get home safely. One afternoon, Thomas found her outside, leaning against the barn door as she fed scraps of hay to a curious mare. The ranch had been her shelter for a handful of days now, and though she remained wary, she seemed less frightened. Thomas approached slowly, so as not to startle her. "Tomorrow," he said in his best attempt at Spanish, "we'll ride out to find your father." Naha brightened, nodding vigorously. She made a motion of a winding trail indicating the direction along the Salt River. Thomas recognized it as the place where he had first seen the Apaches gathering water. That evening, Matthew Harris stopped by with a fresh batch of cornbread. Upon seeing Naha, he gave Thomas a look that teetered between admiration and concern. "You're a braver soul than I, Tom," he muttered as they stepped outside to talk privately. "The folks in town, especially Holcomb and his bunch, think you're inviting trouble by keeping her here. You know there's been talk of Apache raids further east?" Thomas crossed his arms. "Those are other bands, not necessarily hers. I owe this girl my protection. It's what any decent human being would do. Besides, I plan to reunite her with her family soon. Maybe that'll help keep the peace." Matthew sighed. "You might be onto something. A gesture of goodwill could go a long way." "I just hope the tribe sees it that way, and not as if you've taken her hostage." Inside the ranch house, Naha fiddled with one of Eleanor's old shawls, draping it over her shoulders. She held it carefully as if sensing it belonged to someone dear to Thomas. Her face bore traces of innocence, not yet hardened by frontier life. Seeing her that way, Thomas remembered why he'd chosen this path. Maybe the West was full of danger and mistrust, but it was also a place of second chances and forging unbreakable bonds. In saving her, he'd found a fleeting sense of purpose, almost like honoring Eleanor's greatest wish for unity. Tomorrow's journey might bridge two worlds, or it might trigger an even greater conflict. Regardless, Thomas knew he had to try. The morning sky was painted in rosy hues when Thomas saddled up 2 horses Sullivan for himself and a gentle mare for Naha. Though her leg was mostly healed, she still favored it slightly, so he took extra care to ensure she'd ride comfortably. They packed minimal supplies, a canteen of water, some dried jerky, and a few medical essentials, courtesy of Helen Wilcox. Before they departed, Thomas glanced around the ranch, a knot tightening in his gut. He hoped Caldwell's crest would be safe in his absence. Matthew had offered to check on the place every so often, but if outlaws or ill-meaning settlers showed up, there was only so much he could do. Still, Thomas couldn't in good conscience keep the girl from her people any longer. They headed east along the Salt River, the water now calmer after the storm. The first hours of travel passed in relative silence, with Naha occasionally pointing to landmarks or describing them in a mix of Apache and Spanish. Thomas deciphered her meaning by context and gestures. A rock formation shaped like a hawk's head, a shallow cave used as a shelter in winter. He marveled at her knowledge of the land, a knowledge born of generations, living in harmony with the desert's rhythms. About midday, they paused near a creek shaded by cottonwoods to let the horses drink. Thomas handed Naha a strip of jerky, and she accepted with a small smile. She seemed more relaxed in this open environment, away from the uneasy stares of townsfolk. Yet a current of tension ran beneath the surface, an unspoken fear that their journey might lead to confrontation. As they mounted up again, the terrain grew rockier, the vegetation sparser. Thomas recognized the ridgelines from his own exploratory rides years back. Somewhere along these canyon walls, Apaches had historically made hidden camps. By mid-afternoon, he noticed signs of a recent encampment, faint trails, the remains of a fire pit. Naha dismounted, examining the area carefully. She seemed to recognize the footprints, her eyes brightening with hope. Their progress quickened. Yet just as the sun dipped low, a crack of gunfire echoed through the canyon. Thomas jerked in his saddle, scanning for the source. Instinctively, he moved his horse to shield Naha. Another shot rang out, sparking off a rock mere feet away. Their horses whinnied in alarm. Thomas guided Sullivan behind an outcropping, beckoning Naha to do the same. He drew his revolver, heart thudding. Had they stumbled into outlaws or a band of hostile settlers? Was it the same group rumored near Gila Pass? A tense minute passed with no further shots. Then, like ghosts emerging from the stone walls, a group of 3 men on horseback appeared from a narrow trail. One wore a bandana across his face, the other 2 had unkempt beards. Their rifles gleamed in the fading light. "Look what we got here," rasped the one in the lead, pointing his weapon at Thomas. "A rancher and an Apache girl. That's some interesting company." Thomas's mind raced every fiber on edge. He recognized the harsh gaze of men who wouldn't hesitate to spill blood. If these were the outlaws Sheriff Mulligan had warned about, then he and Naha were in grave danger. The wind whistled through the canyon, stirring clouds of dust. Would he have to kill to protect her, or die trying? This was the West, after all, where peace was as fragile as the desert flowers that bloomed and wilted in a single day. Thomas kept his revolver steady, but didn't fire. He weighed his options. The outlaws had the advantage of higher ground and loaded rifles. One rash move could end in bloodshed. Naha crouched behind a rock, fear stark in her eyes. "What do you want?" Thomas asked, voice tense. "Supplies for starters," sneered the bandana-clad man. "I see you've got 2 canteens and maybe some food in your saddlebags. We've been riding hard all day, and we're in need of, well, everything." Thomas recognized the desperation in their tone, but also the ruthless edge that came from men accustomed to taking what they wanted. He glanced at Naha, noticing her trembling. The last thing he wanted was to hand them his supplies and leave himself and the girl defenseless in the desert. Yet he also knew that refusing might provoke a shootout he was unlikely to win. Slowly, he raised his hands in a gesture of compliance. "All right, we can share some supplies. No need for guns." Carefully, he dismounted, placing his revolver at his feet so they'd see he wasn't aiming. He opened a saddlebag, retrieving a small pouch of jerky and a canteen. One of the outlaws dismounted to grab the offerings, but his gaze kept flicking to Naha. "Apache, huh? Didn't figure a rancher would keep such company," he said with a twisted grin. "Maybe we can fetch a pretty penny for her." Thomas felt his blood run cold. The idea of these men hurting or kidnapping Naha was intolerable. He was keenly aware that if a fight broke out, her life would be in as much jeopardy as his. His heart pounded a warning in his chest. "Leave her alone," Thomas said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "She's just a kid." The man chuckled, glancing back at his companions. "A kid, sure, but some folks will pay to keep the peace with Apaches, or to trade her back to her tribe." Thomas's jaw tightened. He realized words alone might not dissuade them. He tried to calculate the odds. 1 revolver, 3 men with rifles, plus uncertain terrain. The lead bandit stepped closer in no apparent hurry, savoring the tension. In the next instant, something unexpected happened. A sharp cry echoed from above the canyon rim. Another figure emerged, an older Apache man, with a bow drawn. He let an arrow loose with startling accuracy, and it thudded into the bandit's shoulder before anyone could react. The man dropped his rifle with a scream of pain. The other 2 outlaws whirled, returning fire with a volley of shots that ricocheted off the rocks. Thomas saw his chance. He dove for his revolver, rolling behind a boulder. Bullets chipped the stone around him. Another arrow sliced the air, and one of the outlaws toppled from his horse, cursing. Meanwhile, the 3rd man spurred his horse and fled, apparently deciding their prize wasn't worth the fight. Cautiously, Thomas peered around the boulder. The bandit who'd been shot in the shoulder lay sprawled, gripping the wound in agony. His partner was either dead or too wounded to move. High above, the Apache bullman remained poised, scanning for more threats. A moment later, he climbed down a narrow path, revealing himself a tall man with deeply lined features, perhaps in his 50s. Naha sprang from her hiding spot and cried out, "Ata father!" Thomas exhaled a shaky breath, chest tight with relief. Fate had intervened, forging a path that might have just saved both their lives. But the scene was still tense. An injured bandit, a dead or dying accomplice, and an Apache father who would soon discover that a white rancher had taken in his daughter. The question now was whether this chance encounter would end in gratitude or unleash another wave of conflict. As soon as Naha flung her arms around her father, all tension evaporated from her small frame. She wept with relief, speaking rapidly in Apache, while gesturing toward Thomas. Her father Chato listened with a stoic expression. His eyes landed on the widowed rancher, measuring him with a warrior's gaze. Thomas remained by the horses, careful not to appear threatening. He glanced at the wounded bandit, who was still moaning in pain. The other, lying a few yards away, had grown silent blood pooling beneath him. Chato issued a sharp command in Apache, and from the rocks above several more tribe members emerged men and women. They surrounded the area, bows drawn, scanning for additional threats. One Apache woman rushed forward to embrace Naha, likely a relative. Another man, tall and broad-shouldered, knelt beside the injured bandit. For a fleeting moment, Thomas worried the Apaches might execute the man out of retribution. But instead, the man simply pushed the bandit's rifle aside, ensuring he posed no further danger. Chato finally approached Thomas. His posture was guarded but not overtly hostile. He spoke in halting Spanish, which Thomas understood enough to piece together. "My daughter says you saved her. From the river, from sickness, and now from these outlaws." Thomas nodded, replying in the same language. "Yes. She was hurt. I only did what anyone should do." A flicker of emotion crossed Chato's features. Perhaps respect, perhaps lingering suspicion. "Our people know your ranch. Some say you are a fair man," he said. Others, he added more grimly, say white men cannot be trusted. Thomas swallowed. "I understand the history. But Naha needed help. I'm glad she's safe now." Chato studied him for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then he gave a single nod, turning to confer with his tribe. The group dispersed, some tending to Naha, others collecting salvageable equipment from the dead outlaw. Chato's second-in-command, an intense young man named Taza, kept glancing at Thomas as if uncertain whether to view him as friend or foe. Eventually, Chato faced Thomas once more. "We will bury the dead man as the white custom." The other one he nodded at the injured bandit, who was being restrained by 2 Apache men. "We will take to the nearest fort if we must, or to your sheriff. He must answer for trying to kill my daughter." Thomas found himself unexpectedly aligned with the Apaches. "I'll vouch for your side if it comes to that." Chato paused, his expression shifting as if deciding something privately. "Our camp is not far. Come with us tonight. Be our guest. We will see if the spirits desire our paths to remain peaceful." Thomas hesitated. He knew entering an Apache camp as the lone white man could be risky. Yet he also recognized an opportunity, perhaps the best one, to build a genuine alliance and carry Eleanor's vision forward. He glanced at Naha, who flashed him a thankful smile. That alone was enough to settle his decision. "I'll come," Thomas said quietly. Chato offered him a hand, and they clasped wrists in a gesture of mutual respect. The desert sun was sinking low, casting elongated shadows across the canyon walls. In that fading light, a bond was forming, one that might either quell the fires of distrust or spark an even larger blaze. Time would tell. The Apache camp sat nestled in a natural alcove where towering cliffs provided protection from harsh winds. Simple wickiups constructed of poles and brush formed a circle while horses grazed in a makeshift corral further down a slope. As dusk fell, fires crackled, and the aroma of roasting game mingled with the sweet scent of sagebrush. Thomas followed Chato's lead, dismounting in a central clearing. Naha walked by her father's side, smiling widely now, reunited with kin. A handful of children peeked from behind the wickiups, whispering and giggling, curious about the newcomer. Some of the older men eyed Thomas warily, but made no moves toward aggression. An older woman, likely an elder, approached and exchanged words with Chato. She then studied Thomas with discerning eyes. Finally, she spoke softly, beckoning him to sit near a large fire pit. All around the tribe settled in small groups. Taza took the injured bandit aside, binding the man's wounds with strips of cloth. The bandit lay silent, glaring at Thomas and the Apaches alike. Chato produced a battered tin cup which he handed to Thomas. The liquid inside smelled like a type of herbal tea. Thomas sipped cautiously. It was bitter, but it chased away the chill creeping in with the night. The flickering firelight illuminated every face in the circle, forging an air of intimacy and focus. In a mixture of Apache and Spanish Chato, explained to those gathered how Thomas had saved Naha from the storm, nursed her at his ranch, and then protected her from the outlaws. Murmurs spread through the group. Some looked incredulous, others nodded in gratitude. Thomas noticed that for every kind glance, another gaze brimmed with mistrust or sorrow, no doubt rooted in past conflicts with settlers. He cleared his throat, deciding it was time he spoke. "I am Thomas Caldwell," he began in Spanish, hoping they understood. "I own a ranch on the Salt River. I helped Naha because she needed help. I have no quarrel with your people." He paused, measuring his words. "I lost my wife, Eleanor, 2 years ago. She believed our peoples could live in peace. I still believe that." Silence followed. Then an old man with silver hair said something in Apache voice, tinged with emotion. Chato translated. "He says he remembers when the soldiers came to our land and many were lost. Peace is something we wish for, but fear can rule men's hearts." Thomas dipped his head. "I understand. I only wish to honor my wife's memory. My ranch is open to trade or to rest if any from your tribe need it." A ripple of reaction passed through the group. In the corner, Taza frowned, clearly skeptical. But Naha looked at Thomas and then around the circle, speaking fervently. Though Thomas didn't catch every word, he sensed she was vouching for him. Chato placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. The elder woman who'd greeted Thomas reached out and touched his arm, nodding. After a time, the conversation broadened to practicalities, possible trade of food or horses, ways to avoid misunderstandings. Thomas felt a cautious hope blossoming. The West was a place where words often failed and bullets took over. But maybe, just maybe, a single rancher's compassion could light a path forward. As the evening wore on, they shared roasted venison. The children eventually dozed off, lulled by the warmth of the fire. Before long, Thomas found his own eyelids growing heavy. Chato offered him a spot beneath a lean-to, assuring him that he would be safe among them this night. Thomas agreed, grateful though the weight of the day's events thrummed in his mind. Tomorrow, they would decide what to do with the wounded bandit. Tomorrow, he would return to his ranch. And tomorrow, the seeds planted tonight would begin to show whether they would bloom in peace or wither under the scorching sun of distrust. Thomas slept more soundly in the Apache camp than he had in weeks at his own ranch. Perhaps it was the communal fire's gentle crackle, or the feeling that he was part of something larger than his solitary grief. At dawn, he woke to find the tribe already buzzing with activity, tending horses, preparing food, and making repairs to shelter structures. After a brief meal, Chato and several others accompanied Thomas down the same trail they'd used to enter the canyon. They brought along the wounded bandit who'd been promised to the authorities. The man complained of pain, but he was alive. 2 Apache warriors flanked him, ensuring he wouldn't attempt escape. By midday, they reached Stonewell, drawing more than a few startled looks from townsfolk. Sheriff Mulligan, alerted by a rider, came out to greet them, eyebrows shooting up in surprise at the sight of Thomas alongside a group of Apaches. Mulligan listened carefully to the account of the attempted robbery and assault. Then he took custody of the bandit, promising to jail him until the circuit judge arrived. The Apaches watched closely, clearly reluctant to trust the town's law. But Mulligan, to his credit, treated them with respect, nodding in acknowledgement of their assistance. Holcomb, leaning against a hitching post, glowered, muttering something about savages under his breath, but no one paid him heed. Thomas then invited Chato and Naha to his ranch, along with several others who had chosen to join. His place was only a short ride away. They arrived at Caldwell's crest before nightfall, greeted by the soft nickers of the ranch horses and the meandering hum of crickets in the brush. Naha eyed the small corral with curiosity, perhaps recalling her days recuperating inside the house. "I have supplies here," Thomas offered, guiding them around. He showed them the barn where extra grain was stored and the pens where livestock grazed. Though modest, it was a testament to his late wife's vision of self-sufficiency. Chato and the other Apaches took in every detail, some nodding in approval. After sharing a simple meal, fresh cornbread courtesy of Matthew Harris, Chato and his kin returned to the canyon, promising to visit again soon. "Your ranch is a good place," Chato said quietly in Spanish before leaving. "Naha says your heart is strong. I see it too." Thomas felt a wave of gratitude and relief. As they departed, he couldn't help but wonder if that would be the last time he saw them, or if the seeds of friendship had truly taken root. 3 days passed in relative calm. Thomas resumed ranch chores, mindful that the precarious peace could shatter if a single bullet was fired by the wrong person. Then on the 3rd morning, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. As it drew closer, Thomas counted at least a dozen Apache riders, no more. Far more. A shimmering wave of color and movement. Realization struck. They were bringing horses, scores of them. Matthew Harris, who had stopped by earlier, stood beside Thomas, eyes wide with amazement. Soon the Apaches swept into the ranch yard, horses snorting and pawing the ground. Chato led the procession. Behind him, riders guided close to 100 horses each, a living testament to the tribe's wealth and skillful breeding. Thomas's heart hammered. He stepped forward, confusion etched across his face. "Chato, what is this?" In solemn tones, Chato explained, "We bring these as gratitude for saving my daughter. Among my people, such a debt cannot remain unpaid. 100 horses for the one life you saved." The magnitude of the gesture left Thomas speechless. Matthew let out a low whistle. Horses were currency out here, power, mobility, prestige. To receive so many was beyond generous. It was a sign of deepest respect, a bond sealed with more weight than any handshake or written treaty. The entire ranch yard seemed electrified with the presence of so much life and possibility. But in the back of Thomas's mind, a tangle of thoughts formed. Was this offering going to cause jealousy or anger among other ranchers? Would Holcomb or the outlaws view this as a threat? Was he now allied so closely with the Apaches that he'd become an even bigger target? Nonetheless, as he stared into Chato's resolute eyes, Thomas felt an undeniable sense of awe. This was more than just a gift of livestock. It was a bridge one forged in the raging waters of a river rescue, tempered by conflict and sealed with gratitude that spanned cultural divisions. Eleanor would have been proud. The arrival of 100 horses at Caldwell's crest did not go unnoticed. By sundown, stories had rippled through Stonewell, fueling imaginations about alliances, conspiracies, and deals made behind closed doors. Some ranchers, still harboring resentment over lost cattle or stolen livestock in previous years, began to whisper that Thomas was colluding with the Apaches. They warned that a group of Indians with that many horses must be up to no good. Sheriff Mulligan tried to keep the peace, reminding everyone that the gift was a gesture of gratitude. Matthew Harris also stood by Thomas, vouching for his friend's decency. But John Holcomb, never one to miss a chance to fan the flames, declared that the Apaches were arming themselves with cavalry and that Thomas's ranch might become a fortress for them. Tensions grew. Meanwhile, the outlaws who had scattered after the canyon fight heard rumors of a veritable treasure trove of horses at Caldwell's crest. Greedy for profit, a small band of them decided to attempt a nighttime raid. Under cover of darkness, they skulked across the desert, determined to steal what they could. Thomas, for his part, felt a potent mixture of pride and anxiety. The horses roamed in a separate corral, now their sheer numbers overwhelming. He'd done his best to care for them, but he knew the gift came with responsibility. He had a sense that big changes were afoot, as if the entire region was teetering on the brink of transformation. One moonlit night, the outlaws made their move. Thomas was awakened by Sullivan's agitated neigh. Grabbing his rifle, he rushed outside, seeing silhouettes moving by the corral. Sparks flew as the bandits tried to break the lock on the gate. At the same moment, a lone Apache sentry, whom Chato had quietly stationed to watch over the prized horses, let loose a sharp whistle. A flurry of activity followed as more Apaches waiting in the shadows rose to defend their communal gift. Shots rang out, muzzle flashes illuminating the corral. The horses spooked, rearing and kicking. Thomas dove behind a water trough, returning fire. He heard cries of pain and the thunder of hooves as some of the animals broke free and galloped into the dark. Within minutes, the outlaws realized they were outnumbered. The Apaches, well trained in silent coordination, flanked them expertly, leaving the bandits with no escape route. 2 men were captured, while a third lay injured in the dust. Another fled, vanishing into the night, empty-handed. In the aftermath, Thomas stood in the corral chest, heaving. Several Apache warriors herded the remaining horses back, speaking soothingly to calm them. By lantern light, Sheriff Mulligan arrived, alerted by a ranch hand who had raced to town. Once again, Mulligan took custody of criminals, and once again, Thomas saw the flicker of understanding in the sheriff's eyes. This was not about cowboys and Indians. It was about right and wrong, about people willing to fight for what was theirs. Word of the foiled raid spread by dawn. Many townspeople re-evaluated their suspicions. Perhaps the Apaches were not the real threat. Perhaps they too were just trying to defend their own. As days passed, the captured outlaws were shipped off to stand trial, and Stonewell's mood began to shift. Folks like Helen Wilcox, and even some of Holcomb's ranch hands, started to murmur that maybe Caldwell's arrangement with the Apaches wasn't so bad after all. By the end of that tumultuous week, Thomas stood at the corral fence, surveying the herd of 100 horses. Naha and Chato were beside him. He placed a hand on Naha's shoulder. "Thank you," he said to them, voice tight with emotion, for trusting me. Chato nodded, eyes reflecting the desert sunrise. "It is we who are thankful, Thomas Caldwell." Together they gazed across the horizon, where the sun gilded the dusty landscape in gold. No words needed to be spoken. They had forged a fragile peace, a real bond that transcended prejudice and fear. And with 100 horses as its symbol, that bond would not soon be forgotten. In the rugged frontier of Arizona, one widowed rancher's courageous act sparked a bond that neither bullets nor betrayal could shatter. Thomas Caldwell's rescue of young Naha bridged a divide that seemed unbridgeable, proving that compassion can outshine the darkest suspicions. His ranch, once marred by grief and solitude, became a place of hope and reconciliation, not just for his Apache friends, but for every townsfolk willing to look beyond fear and see the promise of unity. If this story of resilience and compassion stirred your heart, I invite you to help it reach others. Please like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to the channel. Together we can keep alive the spirit of a Wild West that valued bravery, understanding, and the power of a single good deed to change countless lives. Thanks for riding along on this unforgettable journey. Safe travels, friends.